So I see we have Ward. That's great. That can be on the agenda. Hey, Ward.
Hey.
So I put together just a little agenda for today. One thing we wanted to have, so ask for the team. There are the scheduling polls for future focus conversations around FHIR and OMOP and SQL and FHIR on Spark. So please go to Zulip and vote for those. Wanted to take some time just to make some progress on this outstanding item around intents and shareable profiles. So we can have that. And then Ward, we want to talk about dev days. So just some housekeeping from last time, current to do. So Craig is on the hook to start the Zulip thread around FHIR and OMOP discussion items, have everybody else out here who knows folks in the OMOP community join and potentially join once we have a date for that call. We'd like to interact with the OMOP group. I know some people are chatting with folks from OMOP and Vulcan. Nikolai, updates on the test system. You're on mute, Nikolai, if you're talking.
So are we going to start from updates about tests, or we can talk with Ward and then let the Ward go?
Yeah, let's talk about dev days. Sorry, I dropped that one. So we proposed a couple of sessions. So Ward, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, sure. I think the 3 talks that you've submitted now are...
Should be more. Ward, do you mean? I think we should submit about dozen of talks on FHIR.
Oh,
because you submitted, John submitted, Brian submitted. I don't know what other guys. I submitted one about reference implementation. So it should be really much more.
Yeah. So what I'm referring to is just the 3 talks that Arjun submitted on behalf of this.
So we're talking about like umbrella talks. That's what we're discussing. That we can have umbrella talks or round table. Yeah. Okay.
I see that Ryan also submitted the talk that Arjun has submitted.
Mm-hmm.
I assume a walkthrough of SQL on FHIR.
And John submitted. John, did you submit the talk?
So I didn't actually submit anything on the topic of SQL on FHIR because I assumed that I would do something under the sort of broader SQL on FHIR workshop. I submitted some other unrelated things.
Great.
Yeah, for us, the question was that we can do common session to the general idea that we have multiple implementation, and that's the good thing about SQL on FHIR, that we already have multiple implementation based diversity, and we kind of can imagine the talk where we can tell a little bit about SQL on FHIR, overview, and then go quickly through the implementation and the specific, and showing the whole direction, and then have other specific talks by other guys. So
SQL on FHIR is definitely hot. It's great to have multiple talks on the agenda. Where do you think SQL on FHIR currently is? Because dev days, we always try to focus on stuff that implementers can take right now and go back to their EHR or whatever they work and implement tomorrow, apply it tomorrow. Is SQL on FHIR, is it on that level, or is it on an experimental level, or where on the scale between that?
I think it is a draft, but what's unique that we will really have almost production ready engines for that. Mm-hmm. So we're gonna work on the next connectathon in May on a first draft, but that's unique part about SQL on FHIR, that we really have production ready installation from John, from us, and from other guys, and some reference implementation which is already here, and Graham is working on some implementation. So that's quite unique. So the standard is spec is new, but we really have implementations. So that looks and we're gonna bootstrap the SQL on FHIR, and I think we kind of ready to at least initial draft, and I don't know how it's called, experimental usage, but we are ready for usage. It's not just an idea, it is consistent.
Yeah, it's definitely past indeed lofty ideas, and it's close and it's developing very fast.
And the implementers were ready to do this. That's why we are so close to implementation.
There's definitely a big need for it. So I think one SQL on FHIR kind of overview talk was submitted by Ryan, and also by Arjun for Ryan, I think. So that seems to agree on that one. I guess that's kind of a tutorial level talk, so kind of 45 minutes. And then there was one SQL on FHIR overview and spec deep dive, and a SQL on FHIR use cases and implementations showcase. So I think probably more kind of maybe showing the 3 different implementations. I must say I haven't read them carefully. Arjun, maybe you can take us through what you submitted.
I'll tell you, and I'll tell the team what I submitted, and this is broadly what we talked about last time on this call. I just posted it in the chat. The way we thought about it was that would be that round table aspect that Nikolai was talking about, and I think John mentioned to be a part of that as well. We did something similar in the Connectathon, but that, we'd love to see the multiplicity of implementations there. And then the third one being a hands-on session, a let's build type session. So those are the ones that I proposed. And then Bashir, you mentioned you proposed your own session, which was about your open health stack as well, right? That's the list of all of them I had. I think that's where Nikolai can come in. Out of that set, is anything missing? Do we feel in the group anything would be missing? Because we could have the implement. You could
I
have
think
that
I
second
submitted the
set.
talk about like reference implementation details, like style. So if it's interested for people, because this is like guidelines for future implementations of SQL on FHIR.
The reference, like a
Walk through the reference implementation and describe how people can implement SQL on FHIR.
So where did you submit this, Nikolai? Because I cannot directly find this in my sheet. But maybe I
submitted like 3 talks. I don't know which one.
Yeah, no. Now you mention it. I think I already moved those to another sheet somewhere. Yeah. Okay, there we go. But I see 2 talks from you here.
Well, to me, Nikolai, that sounds like number 3 on my list.
Okay,
right? Like
maybe that's number 3. Okay, let's align.
Yeah, it's maybe a good one to combine that with the other 2 reference implementations, or if I'm wording that correctly. But yeah, that sounds great. We're currently in a review process. They're in that list. So, but I'm sure that there's a lot of interest for SQL on FHIR in general, and also with a great lineup of speakers. So I don't think there should be any problem in getting that through. Yeah. At least those 3 talks that you submitted. I haven't looked at the one from Bashir closely yet. But
so actually, Bart, one question, if you don't mind. When we were submitting, I mean, our product manager actually did this, but there were no, again, like last year, there were like tutorial options, which were like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
But this year, he told me that, there are only like 15 minutes of spots.
Yeah, that's correct. We made some changes there where we used to indeed solicit any types of talks, but we already saw that a lot of, like, as FHIR matures, a lot of the more submissions go to like our real world implementations. So what we call these shorter sessions, but we still upgrade some of them now and then. So we kind of went a bit more carefully in selecting like the longer speakers, concentrating it on a shorter group of speakers. And the submissions was indeed only for the community style talks.
I see. So I put the name of the one that I mean, our product manager actually submitted, just, for your information.
Yeah.
But I don't mind if we want to consolidate. I don't mind to, move these to one of the other talks.
Yeah, because when Nikolai mentioned there's 3 kind of reference implementations right now, and that, I think he mentioned that was one of Health Samurai, that one of CSIRO, and the third one, is that the Google one, or?
I think it's us, right, Nicola? Is that?
Yeah. And probably one more coming from Google. So I don't know, Ryan, what the state of, are you going to present it?
Is this typical Google style, like 2 implementations, or?
Well, yeah, Google
one open source,
like,
one another as well, open source, but on
open source, different approach, I guess. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
And we have another implementation by Graham in Java.
Okay. Yeah. Sadly, Graham won't be at the Dev Day, so this big walkabout. But yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. I think if you're happy with those 3 sessions, then I'm happy with those 3 sessions. It sounds great.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think the only point that I would make, just to make sure the detail that gets in is what we're talking about in the chat, is that that hands-on session with, I'm assuming we're talking about the JavaScript reference implementation here.
Yeah, I can like build health into my session, so I can quickly talk about reference implementation, some details, and second part could be people can try it and use like through the interactive page, so we can walk through some examples. So if this works, like I think.
Is the JavaScript implementation your implementation, Nikolai?
It is part of spec. So we decided to have a reference implementation as a part of spec. It's a part of specification.
Okay, so there is, excuse me, I'm new here. There's a reference implementation and there's also a Health Samurai implementation, or
So there's a Health Samurai implementation. It's a Postgres implementation, yes. And the reference implementation, which after Josh we are guiding, like managing in the spec. So the spec contains reference JavaScript implementation. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about the spec implementation, and we will show what we did in Health Samurai on the like implementation showcases session, not a separate.
Yeah. So I think it may be that your talk will be folded into the roundtable of showing like the 3 different.
Yeah.
Representation. Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for putting this together, Arden.
Oh, you're welcome, certainly.
So next time we're gonna occupy the whole track.
That's awesome. You have to fight the CQL guys and the AI people, but
Oh yeah, let's mix us with the SQL guys, and I think that would be very nice mix.
yeah, that sounds great. Maybe we should, or always wonder whether we should spread it out over multiple days or whether we should concentrate it. Yeah, nice. Good. I want to derail your regular SQL programming longer.
Oh,
Thanks.
yeah, please reach out with any questions. But
Yeah, will do. Thanks.
all right. Good.
Thanks.
All right. So next up, just back to the current to-dos and regular housekeeping. So test system, can you give us an update?
Igor started working with the Max, and we got feedback from John, and yeah, I hope we will cover it in a few days. I know Igor.
So yeah, we've added some additional tests, made sure that all the tests contain the valid resources, and now we are on to validate all the view definitions in our tests, and to implement suggestions from John. And also we got feedback from John like today, and we skimmed through it and found it very helpful. So we will incorporate that into into the test suite, and yeah, basically that's it. We're also having a plan to switch from generating tests from JavaScript to actually running JSON files, because we feel it would be the better way to have reference implementation also read from JSONs like any other implementation is supposed to, but it's a subject to discuss, I guess. And yes, basically we're on
a
track.
short-term plan. Yeah, we will do the test feedback from 8-box implementation, and we want to work with John, so collect the test results from FHIR implementation as well. So when John, whenever you're ready, we can start like working on this matrix page, and then we will serve as examples for other guys to start reporting.
Great. I mean, that sounds like really good progress. I think what would be the next step to do? Do we even need it to do on this, or should it just be running in the background?
Well, I think like the other thing is like just the overall coverage. So I updated that spreadsheet, which we sort of had a wish list on the left-hand side, and we're actually getting there. We're probably about 90% of the way there to our original sort of envisioned coverage of the tests. So I just feel like, yeah, we should focus on getting that to as close to 100% covered as possible. And I think that alongside with the editorial stuff that people are generously doing on the content of the spec, that'll see us sort of well placed to sort of present this as a draft upcoming.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. You're talking about the feature list for milestone 1, right? John, in terms of coverage.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if we can have good test coverage over our sort of list of features that we're planning to call this first milestone, that'd be great.
Okay, great. That sounds awesome. Yeah, I think there's no potentially specific to do here. I think this is sort of generalized for everyone to continue to work and support the test infrastructure and increase the coverage. So I'll set that up in the to-dos. Any other thoughts or questions around test coverage, test infrastructure? Okay, sounds good. Yep, I already mentioned the polls and reaching out to the OMOP community. Did I see?
Yes, I can.
Oh, there you are. Okay,
yes.
Great.
Sorry for just putting this in just before the meeting, but so I went through the JSON schema guidance page and the columnar schema page, and they're both, I think, predate kind of where we landed on view definitions. So they're very prescriptive about trying to standardize things like naming and data types, as well as like specific algorithms for addressing some of the challenges in serializing FHIR data into other schemas. And so I think a lot of that probably isn't relevant to the way the spec has evolved. So I think there's maybe 2 approaches that might make sense, although certainly open to other ideas as well. So one would be to pull out the pieces of that are sort of general purpose. And I think there's a lot of commonality between the pages. They kind of address some of the same challenges with FHIR data around, contained resources, infinite recursion, choice types, state precision, float precision, like all those things. And we could provide some kind of general guidance and say, like if you're building a data layer for FHIR data, here are some of the things that you should consider, and here are some potential ways that you could address them. So, like specifying a max level of recursion, which I think a lot of our implementations have done, stuff like that. So that's one way we could go, and I'd be happy to take a crack at that if folks want to go that route at drafting that. The other thing we could do is we could just decide that that's out of scope, since it's not necessarily doesn't necessarily need to be standardized. And so I think it's just a question of whether we want to include that in version 1 of the spec, or we want to kind of contain the spec to just things that are very specific, like view definition, structure, and take out some of the data layer pieces for now. So I don't have a strong opinion kind of either way on that. I wanted to throw it out to the group and see what people were thinking. But I think as they currently exist, and I think we have to do something with these pages, because I think they're very confusing, and they're also not super relevant in terms of the guidance. The guidance we give isn't super relevant in terms of the current structure of SQL on FHIR. So I'll pause. I see a couple folks have hands. I think Ryan, you would put up your hand first.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we maybe like touched on this briefly in the previous meeting, and so there's some discussion of like, hey, there's some good content in there. It's certainly confusing. If maybe some stuff like this should exist somewhere, but maybe in a separate implementation guide independently of the core spec. So keep the core spec sort of clean, small, and simple. And then if we want to have guidance for a column or a JSON, we could have those in a separate repository. I think that makes a great deal of sense to me. I think there is general consensus for that. I'll toss out a straw man just in the interest of sort of like simplifying things and maybe kind of getting us progress on the core spec. Because like I think I'd be okay with, if other folks are, simply removing it from the GitHub page as it exists today. We can just delete those outright. They're still in the history. We'll still be able to get those if there's good content that we want. We want it, and for if you others, I'd be happy to participate as well, are interested in putting together a separate IG that has this guidance for that, and that can be an independent effort. And that way we can kind of maybe make the spec itself smaller, more constrained, and have it all in good shape, and in a completely independent thread, we can pursue whatever guidance we want to pursue there. So I guess that's what I'll toss out for feedback for discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think Angelo was up next.
Yeah, I just a perspective of someone who's brand new to it and reading it kind of for the first time. I think it would benefit from just an introductory section that kind of talks about who the target audience is and what we're, where to go. I do like the way the CQL group kind of has it broken into chapters, where you have chapter 2 is for authors, chapter 3 is for developers. And it makes it a little easy to kind of go figure out where your reference is. And then there's these appendices that have like very deep information where you start saying, okay, like as I was reading through it, some of the questions I had as I was reading about, how do you handle extensions, for example? They're first-class citizens. What does that mean exactly? And how would I represent? How do I go find it? Am I looking for a URI? Some examples and things. Maybe that's an appendix item or something. But I think it would be kind of nice to have like a chapter 1. This is what it is, and here's how you get started. And then chapter 2, here's a reference to maybe the view definition, and chapter 3 SQL, and maybe some appendices. Something like that I think would be super helpful, especially for someone brand new who's kind of just figuring out what is it even and how do I get involved. That's my 2 cents anyway.
Great, thanks for that. I think we can put that out to the whole group. I think Bashir was next.
Yeah, sorry. So first, starting with a funny comment. So please, whatever you do, keep this page, or at least make sure that it's being redirected to somewhere that it exists still. So this is the old SQL on FHIR GitHub, the one that I just put on the chat. The reason I'm asking this is because this has been heavily referenced in our documentation, our communication with partners, and everything. And a lot of things is like all over the place. So it would be nice that this always works, or at least being redirected to something. Now, I agree with the point that it is probably the current columnar recommendation is kind of misplaced in the view, SQL on FHIR v2 repo, and it can be removed from there, but it can be expanded. There is value in having that document. Now, the second point regarding that spec is that we were talking with John, and I think we kind of agreed, and John can correct me to the discussion that we had last week. So basically, it would be nice that we have this as like general recommendation, but it's not concrete enough because it's not talking about any specific like a schema. You can apply this to Parquet, you can apply it to Avro, you can apply it to wherever you need like a schema for FHIR. But then it would be nice to pick one. And I suggest, and I think John agreed, that we pick like Parquet as a very concrete schema definition. So basically, and we need to work on that. This could be like a separate IG, like Ryan said. But then the output of that would be that, okay, this is how you map FHIR to Parquet. Very specific, like, this is how you manage like extensions, for example. That's exactly how it needs to look like.
Bashir, so your suggestion was to keep the content as because it has a lot of value, but also have specific, potentially specific IG specific to Parquet. Do you have an opinion about keeping this content maybe in the spec itself or removing it? I don't know if you have a thought about that.
I briefly mentioned, I think it makes sense to remove it from the current, like the view definition, like where we have the, like SQL on FHIR v2, where we have the view definition. It makes sense to take it out because I agree, it's a little bit confusing that, why is this thing here? I mean, all of us understand why, but I guess for someone who just comes and read that, IG, it's not very clear. So my suggestion is to take it out from there, move it back to where it was. Again, this is just a suggestion, and then expand that with a concrete example like Parquet.
Okay, got it. I just wanted to understand what you're proposing for your position there. Josh?
Yeah, just to sort of synthesize what we've heard so far, what I'm hearing is a consensus that we can sharpen the scope of our existing IG and remove some of the drag content about the data layer. I think there's agreement that more work should happen around that content, but in a separate scope. And then Bashir makes the very good point that we shouldn't break links on the web that people are depending on. I think right now, all the links that Bashir mentioned are to the 1.0 spec. So nothing we're going to do is going to break that right now. Anything we want to do in the future, we can be very sure to include kind of a manifest of all locations just to make sure those keep forwarding. I think that's just something to keep in mind. I do think it is worth including some of the outbound pointers in our spec. In other words, a page for implementation considerations that says, if you're trying to implement the data layer, there's a number of things you need to consider. Follow this link to a wiki or another IG or whatever it is, just so readers can follow that trail of breadcrumbs to get to the next spot.
Thanks, Josh. Nikolai, you're up next.
Yeah, and I'm out the body of the spec. So I think guys like Angela can contribute a lot if you just give us the questions. So where you're reading the spec and you have a question which are not answered. Yes, I use this framework quite often. So if you can just bomb us with the questions which are not answered by the spec, yes. So we will try to shape the spec text to answer these questions. Because essentially you send this email to me with a set of questions which maybe we can like share with the guys, because this is a very good question which should be answered with the spec. If spec doesn't answer this question, it doesn't meet the need. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion as well. And of course you can post those questions on Zulip as well, where we can see it. We can potentially even track them in GitHub or track them in a more formalized way. Just going back to Dan's initial proposal about creating a data layer guidance page, I think from my viewpoint, removing the columnar schema guidance page makes total sense into a separate IG and separate location. That I think we all have agreement on. But I'm wondering about a more generalized data layer guidance page, right? That would be potentially like in an appendix of the spec itself. So I'll put that out as a straw man, because I think that has value in the sense that generalized guidance across different kinds of database types, I think has a lot of value. And I'm not quite sure like how that would be findable by someone coming in from the outside, right? I think people might hear about SQL on FHIR, sort of get the general gist, the general idea, they'll want to look at, a very tightly specified spec about view definition. Sure, I agree with that. But my guess is, or a strong feeling is that then people also want to have a good understanding about what the recommendations are of the group around generalized guidance around the data layer and about sort of data layer preparation. So I'm concerned that if it goes somewhere else, I'm not quite sure what its home is. So I wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I feel like, so just having a look at the spec, I feel like we could rationalize it a bit. To Angela's point, maybe there's a home page and there's sort of a purpose page. And then there's also this systems layer page that's under spec. I feel like perhaps they could be combined somehow. you know, so here's what it's about. This is what it's for. Here's a simple example. This is how it fits with other concepts and layers. But the actual spec content is really the view definition, the processing model, potentially a section on the test that doesn't exist yet. And then, as we've been talking about, potentially move that guidance bit out. I think we've also got these couple of sections under C also to make a decision about. So we've got this tech matrix, and we've sort of parked some content in this sort of miscellaneous area. We probably need to make a decision on where that goes as well.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like the right approach to me. It's sort of combining that view of the content structure and what Ryan was saying too, which is, I think, reduce. Right now we have too much, right? Reduce, start with cleaning house a little bit. And I think, John, you were proposing like combine home and purpose together. They seem a bit distinct into something broader that encompasses sort of both. I think most specs really do have that homepage, which is, you know, fairly long, but does satisfy both purposes, which have just simplified the structure. Then I'm just kind of repeating back what I heard from you, you know, a spec layer, which is sort of the normative, like this is the content that I really need to understand in terms of if I want to do an implementation. And then I'm suggesting, but, you know, open to interpretations and options here about, you know, potentially having like an appendix guidance. So guidance is a little bit separated from the spec, the core spec itself. And then potentially, you know, getting rid or just cleaning up those see also pages, which are pretty, you know, they're not very up to date. So how does that sound as a sort of a general structure? And then, you know, we can have folks potentially, you know, assign tasks to take a look at that, implementing that. We generally feel like that's a fairly good model. Maybe next, sounds good to John. Do we have any volunteers for taking a pass at that, of rationalizing the structure?
I mean, I don't mind taking a pass at it. To be frank, my inclination down this path is like I'm looking at the page now and is basically it's I mean, I think that I would remove the guidance section in the V2 GitHub like entirely, and because I think that and that can grow in a separate IG and a separate effort. Looking at like the see also sections, I mean, most of I'd be almost inclined to, I'm not sure. Well, there's the artifacts is just kind of, the artifacts page is just a generated page under the see also section. So I'd almost be inclined to perhaps definitely remove the miscellanea page. And I'm not sure if even the tech matrix page, that's definitely kind of out of date. Maybe I'd be inclined to remove that as well. And that can grow. We can put that content back into a separate, I mean, if those sort of rough parameters of like taking and then also like reorganizing, like, the home and purpose, I think combining those and cleaning up the top content makes sense. I mean, I'm willing to that's going to be like a significant, reorganization of content. I'm okay with taking a pass at it if that general approach, we have consensus on the general approach that I outlined there.
And I really did create my personal task to describe test runners. So I promise next week. I
think there's a general consensus, Ryan, what you're saying is that like definitely there's a restructuring, pretty deep restructuring that's needed here, right? And so, maybe as a first start, just laying out what you might, what you might do in a outline form in Zulip so people can take a look at it, something like that. But I think there's a general consensus around it. The one point that I made before that I think is, I'm thinking about it now, that idea of generalized guidance for the data layer, it may not necessarily need to be in the spec itself, but I still feel like there should be a home for it. I mean, that could potentially be on GitHub as well. Like we do have an option to put pages on GitHub as well. So just putting that out there. Dan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, also just on that last point, I think Josh had mentioned maybe like putting that on a wiki, which I think is a really good location for that sort of guidance so people can contribute. Like, oh, this is another thing I ran into on my data layer. Like, here's something you may want to consider. And I think potentially down the road, if we have like a Parquet guide and maybe some other guides, we could also link to those. I think those do deserve to be somewhere in the spec, link out. So I don't see why we wouldn't add those, even just a section on the homepage of like additional guidance for implementers or something. But I like Ryan's idea a lot. I think like a good approach might be to clear it out to like the very minimum we think would be a good spec, and then do pull requests to kind of add things back. And nothing's disappearing; it's all on GitHub. So that way we're kind of, not agonizing too much over what to keep and doing kind of something as simple as possible. And then as people have sections that they like or think are missing, we can add those back pretty easily. So I guess I personally rather than having a lot of discussion over each thing we're taking out, I would, from my perspective, I think it makes sense to have one person, or we could do it at a connect-a-thon with a couple people if we want to wait. Just kind of go through and hack it to a minimum spec, and then folks can add pull requests to add sections or add features back, and then down the road. Just last point, I think having a split between kind of a user's guide and an implementer's guide is going to be important. But
yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we have consensus on just a general approach, start with that core of the minimum spec and then start there, which we have, pretty good alignment on, and then, use PRs to add or suggestions to add, and we can talk about it asynchronously as well. This is not like we're not going to do this every week on our call, but if we have a good path forward, and I think that the sense of the group is that we do in terms of that. So that works for me. The one question I had is just about wiki. Is there a general wiki that is used for this? Or are we talking about GitHub wiki or something like that? Any thoughts on specific wiki? It's a minor point, but
I think it's either GitHub or Confluence. The HL7 Confluence would be the two contenders.
Yeah, let's not do Confluence. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I don't think that's a decision we have to really make, but I just wanted to ask right off the bat. So
I think start with the GitHub will be easier, at least at the beginning, because and later we can move to the Confluence. And about spec, I think we can go even more agile, and flexible. Let's create the Google Doc and shape the structure and iterate over it, and then maybe dump it to the repo. What do you think? So it could be much faster, yes. So people just come in, put comments and changes.
So maybe maybe break this down into two phases. And so one is there's a bunch of stuff in that up there that probably shouldn't be there, and so maybe we'll take a phase of let's delete what we're pretty confident doesn't belong in the core spec, still be in GitHub history. We can move that elsewhere as needed or move it to other IDs. So get to this, just like one phase of just removing stuff, and then a second phase of taking what we have, which we know we want to include, and then we can, I think, use a doc or other collaborative mechanism to figure out what the best way to structure it is. So I think that'll allow us to focus. If trying to have what content to include and how to structure it as the same conversation, then I think that maybe having them as separate conversations of let's simplify, let's remove stuff that we know that we don't want to include, and then we can figure out how to structure it. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah.
I think especially the content on the homepage lends itself really well to Nikolai's idea of a Google Doc. So once we know we need a homepage that explains the project and what the goals are and non-goals, that kind of thing. That feels like a good collaborative editing type of document, and that's hard to do on GitHub.
Yeah,
right. That sounds good to me, but I think that's going to be the best way to be asynchronous as well. So let's go with that plan. Phase one, take a pass at removing content, and then I would say kind of in between there, potentially a restructuring of and then the third phase or second phase about use Google Docs to collaboratively work on content improvements. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, great. All right. So probably everyone's sick of talking about the spec. So we have 10 minutes left. I don't think I have anything else in terms of agenda. So I'll just open it up to the group.
I think Igor mentioned that in John, comments to tests was some stuff which should be discussed because it could be implementation specific. Igor, can you tell what exactly?
I saw the thing. We have an off type function that is and there is a test that tests if how this function reacts to the invalid type inside it as an argument. And I have a question: does it really need to fail with an exception or something, or should it just silently return null in the column and kind of that's it? I haven't found any explanation of that in the spec. So I wanted to ask if anyone has an opinion on that.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of investigation into this. So there's an of type definition in the FHIR path spec, And then there's a clarification of type in the context of FHIR in the FHIR spec. And in the FHIR spec, it says that only concrete core types are allowed as an argument. So to me, that means that in the context of FHIR, you pass FHIR types to of type. And if it's not a FHIR type, I guess that's an error. I'm not sure, but that's my reading of it.
But you proposing the rule, if the FHIR path think this is error, it should be error in view definition.
Yeah, I think this is this may be the expected behavior, but I didn't find a concrete statement of that. I also checked FHIR path, the FHIR path specification, and for me it doesn't really make it clear. But yeah, and the FHIR path implementation, that is HL7, yes, it just simply returns null. I mean, it doesn't fall. It doesn't fall at all. It just wrong type. Sorry, something like that. Off point. So yeah, my question was if it should fall or not, and I get that John suggests it should fall, which I agree with. I think it would be nice. So yeah.
We're not yet decided, so I don't agree. Ryan, what do you think?
Well, I think that, I mean, we touched on maybe to generalize conversation a little bit to just error handling in general. And like, I remember in like some of the previous connectathons and that sort of thing, but there's like a realization that you might have error conditions that work for 99.99% of your records, and then have a very rare failure case and that sort of thing. And so I think because of those sorts of things, and also because different implementations have different error handling semantics, it was kind of difficult to have like a really strong must definition of error handling semantics for all these scenarios. So I think that the rough model that we are considering is more of like if to use the standard speak, like a should type of definition, and something along the lines of, the system should report an error in whatever way is easily surfaced in the specific technology stack, and maybe not provide a whole lot more guidance than that. I mean, we can figure out exactly how much we want to provide and what in that space, but I think that the TLDR of a lot of that comes down to the fact is like error handling will be implementation specific to some extent, and yeah, I agree that's not really expressed in the spec today, that we need to clarify that. But I think but just because of the fact that different systems will handle these errors in such different ways, it makes it difficult to kind of have like a strong recommendation within the spec along these lines. But yeah, others comment as well.
But in general, I think we should like follow FHIR spec. If it's must or something like this, yes, so then we do support. If it's, let's say, we should decide, are we going write any tests for what should or not?
Yeah.
We can just mention that we are not covering this, and this is implementation specific.
I think that's a good point. If something's like clearly malformed, so if something is malformed FHIR path that you can detect statically independently of the data, so then yeah, I think we should, maybe that's at least a should fail at load time, and maybe a must, because I think we want to be able to expose as much as possible there. There are other areas that you don't detect until runtime, and when you're evaluating the FHIR path over some specific data that doesn't match its assumptions, and in those cases, then it may be left to the implementation. Yeah, John has been hands-on for this, so please, John, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Or are we talking about the scenario where you say, observation.value.ofType markdown? First scenario is you're talking about a completely non-existent type that doesn't even exist in FHIR, and that's never going to be valid. The second type, it's not really valid because there's no markdown type for an observation value if you really dive into the definition of observation, but it's still a valid type. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like the first one, you can know that that's invalid without any data, without even any definition of the element that you're traversing or anything. But the second one is more like, I feel like that's probably more like a null, because, in order to, the bar for determining whether that's valid is really quite high.
But there is another point, which is Igor told. Yes, let's say, for example, FHIR-path.js just to ignore this stuff. So it doesn't check. It doesn't have built-in check. And we agree that implementing FHIR-path from scratch is not the best idea for most of developers. So, and we should be quite careful about this. I mean, if we force to fail on, let's say, of type doc, yes, so it still may be problematic for implementation. But you mentioned the last time that we can introduce like another role, like view validator or operation, which say validate. And for that operation, we can be quite strict. Yes, we can probably introduce like requirements. It should validate existing types up to types which are really defined by union types. Yes. Because if you go even further and introduce profiles, then it could validate even more, yeah, than what we have. So, but it could be like separate validate specification where we can be quite strict. In the case of the general spec, so we should follow what the FHIR pass providing, because it's more probably how FHIR pass implementation will behave, yeah, which people will use it. But for the validation, we can discuss, because I see this is a very nice idea to have a separate implementation. We just check that the view definition is valid, like specific operations. So, and it could be quite strict about this. So we can create the test cases, for example, for this validate stuff. So, and try to put as much like strict rules for that as possible, and for implementers, make it optional. So they could implement this validate block like module, but or they can skip it.
Yeah, I think we can be more lenient on that. I am curious about how they implement that in FHIR-Path.js, because, you know, like it's a type specifier and you kind of have to try and figure out what it is by searching.
I can tell you, in
space.
dynamic languages, they just concatenate value or like type of you do and getting this attribute. That's how we do this in JavaScript, because I started implementation of FHIR-Path.js and I did it in Clojure. So you don't use this information. You may use this, but you have to do extra steps like pulling schemas and checking. So, but it's even more generic. I mean, in dynamic languages. So, because of type, it's usually just turn it into concatenating strings. And I think in Josh implementation, Josh just like replace with a regex value dot type off with a value quantity or something like this. And this is in a dynamic language. It's more straightforward implementation like this than like pulling schema and checking that is it possible or not.
Oh, I see that. Sorry, we're over time. I just wanted to make sure, was there any consensus around, a decision or any steps
I think we
forward we
should
want to take on
start
that?
Threat and Zulip, because I don't think that we completely agree on this yet. So let maybe Igor, can you start Threat and Zulip and we will discuss it, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
All right. We're at the end. So thanks, everybody. I think we're good for this week. So appreciate it.